Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Venezuela and the resource curse. Here is what you will get in this episode, right from the start. A clear origin story for how oil wealth took center stage. A simple, memorable explanation of the resource curse and Dutch disease. And the early warning that told leaders to sow the oil, not spend it. If you have ever wondered how a blessing can quietly rearrange an entire economy's incentives, this is your slide. Let's set the stage. In the 19-teens and early 1920s, oil fields around Lake Maracaibo roar to life. Seemingly overnight, the new petroleum economy promises revenue, hard currency, and the feeling that the future has arrived. By mid-century, oil is not just another export. It is the export. It funds the budget. It shapes planning. It changes what the state can do and what citizens expect it to do. Cheap barrels. Expensive mistakes. That tension begins here. Economists have a name for this paradox. The resource curse. Not a prophecy, but a pattern. When a country earns large, concentrated rents from a single commodity, power and attention flow toward that rent stream. The state becomes the main gatekeeper. Private actors learn to line up at the gate. And because money is flowing in, it feels like success even when underlying capabilities are not improving. Ask yourself, are we building permanent strengths, or are we rearranging the furniture every time the oil price moves? Now, a closely related mechanism. Dutch disease. Here is the idea in plain language. Big inflows from oil push up the exchange rate or domestic costs relative to the rest of the world. Suddenly, non-oil tradable sectors, think agriculture beyond the basics, light manufacturing, exportable services, find it harder to compete. The oil bonanza makes imports cheaper, but it also makes your own producers less competitive abroad. Over time, the economy tilts. The most talented people, the best capital, and the sharpest political focus migrate toward oil and the state institutions that distribute its rents. It is not that the other sectors vanish. It is that they stop growing where it matters. Slowly, quietly, predictably, Venezuela's own thinkers saw this early. In 1936, a powerful phrase enters the conversation. Sow the oil. Sembrar el petróleo. It means take windfalls and plant them in people and productivity. Schools, skills, infrastructure, innovation. Convert exhaustible rents into lasting capacity. The phrase sounds poetic, but it is really hard-nosed economics. Because a barrel can be burned only once. But skills, credible rules, and functioning institutions compound over time. Here is the incentive picture to keep in mind as we move forward. Oil rents make the state look stronger in the short run. They also raise the stakes of controlling the state. That changes behavior. It can reward lobbying over entrepreneurship, discretion over rules, distribution over discipline. The longer the boom, the easier it is to confuse revenue with real development. The warning on this slide is simple. Institutions and incentives decide whether a windfall becomes scaffolding for broad-based growth, or a crutch that weakens the very muscles a society needs to stand on its own. Pause and reflect. What would it take to turn a volatile commodity stream into stable progress? Transparent rules, predictable budgets, and investment in the kinds of capabilities that do not evaporate when prices fall. That is the challenge framed by this first slide. The rest of the story will test whether that early warning, so the oil, was heeded or merely admired from a distance. On this slide we move from geology to governance. How do laws and institutions turn oil into a system? 3 milestones tell the story. The 1943 Hydrocarbons Law, the 1976 nationalization that created PDVSA, and the 2001 hydrocarbons reform that pulled decision-making back to the center. Watch how each step changes incentives. First, the 1943 Hydrocarbons Law. Think of it as the country's first serious attempt to write a stable, comprehensible contract with the industry. Taxes and royalties were clarified. Auditing and reporting rules tightened. Concessions were standardized so investors knew the terms and the state knew its share. Out of this framework emerged the famous 50-50 concept that spread by the late 1940s, roughly half of the oil profit to the state, half to the companies. Why did that matter? Predictability. With rules on paper, capital could plan multi-year drilling and refining projects, and the treasury could plan budgets. The state's revenues grew, but so did its dependence on a single fiscal tap. When your main tax handle is a barrel, you start watching the price board like a heart monitor. Second, 1976. Nationalization. PDVSA is born. This was not just a change of ownership, it was a bet on a particular model of state enterprise. The design goal was technocracy. Keep politics at arm's length. Compete globally on engineering, safety, and cost. For a time, PDVSA earned a reputation as a serious operator with professional management and rigorous internal standards. But the institutional math also changed. The state was now regulator and owner, referee and player. That creates classic principal-agent questions. Who sets long-term strategy? How are managers evaluated? On production targets, on cash transfers to the treasury, or on commercial returns? If the most important customer is the national budget, investment decisions can drift toward the urgent rather than the strategic. You can see the tension, a company judged by commercial metrics operating inside a state judged by political ones. Third, the 2001 Hydrocarbons Law. This reform re-centralized authority and raised the government's take, establishing a royalty baseline around 30% and making PDVSA the majority partner in new ventures. In plain English, the state pulled more of the lever directly. The logic was straightforward: capture more rent for the public and assert sovereignty over an exhaustible resource. But higher statutory royalties and tighter control changed the spreadsheet for marginal fields, heavy oil, and long lead investments. Projects that looked profitable at a lower government take suddenly required higher prices, better geology, or cross-subsidy from elsewhere. Decision rights migrated upward, from engineers and project managers to ministries and central committees. When more choices are centralized, outcomes hinge more on discretion and less on decentralized feedback from costs and cash flow. Step back and see the arc. From negotiated sharing in the 1940s, to state ownership in the 1970s, to renewed central control in the early 2000s. Each turn increased the weight of the state inside the oil value chain. None of these steps is inherently good or bad, each carries trade-offs. Clear laws can attract investment. A capable national company can defend national interests. Stronger central levers can raise public revenue. But every lever also shifts incentives. When the same institution writes the rules, runs the rigs, and funds the budget, the quality of those internal checks becomes the whole ballgame. The question this slide leaves you with is simple. How do you preserve efficiency, transparency, and investment discipline when the center holds most of the strings? On this slide we zoom in on 3 jolts that rewired how the oil system functioned day to day. A labor shock inside PDVSA. A set of currency controls that redefined who could import and at what price. And a nationalization push that redrew the Orinoco heavy oil map. Each one is a switch on the wall. Flip all 3, and the room feels very different. First, the PDVSA strike of 2002 to 2003. Imagine the National Oil Company as a giant cargo ship. It is powerful, but it does not turn on a dime, and it depends on a crew that knows every valve, every safety protocol, every maintenance quirk. During the confrontation, operations stalled. Afterward, roughly 18,000 employees were dismissed, around 40% of the workforce. That is not just a number. It is accumulated experience walking out the door in a few weeks. Senior engineers who could diagnose a compressor by its sound. Schedulers who could rebalance crude blends on a bad day. Maintenance teams who knew exactly which gasket fails under heat. Can you replace headcount? Yes. Can you replace tacit knowledge at the same speed? That is much harder. The organization's muscle memory thins out. Training pipelines lengthen. Preventive maintenance can slip toward reactive fixes. And when the budget is tight or the political clock is ticking, the urgent tends to crowd out the essential. Second, 2003 brings Khedive and exchange controls. Let's translate the jargon. Before, dollars were acquired on a market, imperfect as it was. After Khedive, access to dollars for imports was allocated by an administrative mechanism at an official rate. In theory, that promises stability and priority for essentials. In practice, it creates a long line at a single window. Some applicants are approved quickly, others wait, and some never get through. Meanwhile, the official rate diverges from what people are willing to pay outside the system. That gap is not just an accounting curiosity. It is an incentive. If you can buy $1 at the official rate and sell $1 at the other rate, the margin is real. The result is predictable. Arbitrage opportunities multiply. Importers who cannot secure official dollars delay orders. Spare parts arrive late. Inventories thin. The administrative file becomes as important as the purchase order. Ask yourself, what do managers focus on when the exchange rate depends on an approval stamp? They hire compliance fixers and queue navigators. They learn the system because the system decides whether the valve or the medicine shows up. Third, 2007 and the Orinoco heavy oil nationalizations. The operating agreements that had attracted a roster of global firms were restructured into joint ventures with PDVSA as the majority partner. The message was sovereignty and a larger public share of the rent. The consequence was a reshuffling of partners and plans. Some companies accepted the new terms, others exited and sought arbitration. But beneath the headlines is a quieter shift. Decision rights move. Capital budgeting moves. Procurement moves. When you tilt control toward the center, you increase the number of approvals a project must secure before it advances. Heavy oil projects have long lead times and complex logistics. They need stable assumptions about who pays, who buys, who decides. Change those assumptions and projects are repriced in real time. Some go forward, some slow, some stop. Put these three shocks together. A human capital shock inside the operator. A currency regime that turns dollars into permits. And a governance change that concentrates ownership and decision rights. None of these, on its own, guarantees failure. But each one bends the system in a specific direction. Less redundancy in expertise. More friction in importing inputs. More discretion consolidating at the top of the decision tree. When you add them, you get a path that relies increasingly on administrative problem solving rather than decentralized feedback from prices, profits, and engineering constraints. That is the architecture this slide leaves us with. The next slides will test how it performs when the weather changes. This slide feels good at first glance, and that is exactly why we have to slow down. The mid-2000s deliver a powerful oil windfall. Crude prices surge, dollars pour in, and the public sector suddenly has room to move. Budgets grow. Programs expand. New missions appear with ambitious names and immediate targets. If you are measuring by cash on hand, the story looks like liftoff. Let's talk about what that money did. Social programs, known as missions, rolled out to address long-standing gaps, health access, adult literacy, subsidized food, housing initiatives. In many communities, outcomes improved in the short run. Clinics opened. Shelves that had once been thin saw staples return. Poverty rates, measured by income, visibly declined while oil prices stayed strong. If you lived through those years, you remember the sense of possibility. The boom gave policymakers a crisp, near-term metric to chase, spend the windfall, move the needle, show results. But there is a second ledger on this slide that matters just as much as the first. Where did the money flow, and under what rules? A significant share of oil revenues began to move through off-budget vehicles, most notably a National Development Fund. Off-budget sounds technocratic, but the effect is simple. You shift spending and investment decisions outside the ordinary budget, beyond the slow grind of legislative debate, and away from the reporting and auditing routines that build institutional memory. In the short term, this speeds decisions. In the long term, it weakens transparency and accountability, because the paperwork that teaches future officials what worked and what failed is thinner or scattered. Here is the economic logic to keep in view. Booms tempt governments into procyclicality. When prices rise, spending rises faster. When prices stabilize, obligations remain. The classic stabilizing tools are dull but effective: save in a rainy day fund, pay down hard currency debt, invest in projects that raise future productivity rather than current applause. The risky tools are the ones that feel great right now: permanent entitlements funded by volatile rents, large off-budget commitments, and investment choices made with soft project appraisal. During the mid-2000s, the balance tilted toward the second set. Now consider the structure of the economy under the surface. Oil rents raise domestic demand. Imports respond quickly because they do not require years of investment. Non-oil tradables, by contrast, need patient capital, reliable inputs, and a stable policy horizon. If logistics delays grow, or if the exchange rate regime introduces uncertainty about future costs, private investors hesitate. The result is a compositional shift: more consumption financed by oil, less momentum in sectors that would earn foreign exchange without oil. It is not that factories close en masse, it is that fewer new factories appear and older ones delay upgrades. Over a few years that gap is invisible. Over a decade, it becomes structure. Think about incentives inside the public sector during a windfall. If your performance is judged by how much you disperse and how many programs you launch, you design for scale and speed. Procurement expands, often under pressure to deliver quickly. The bottleneck shifts from money to management. Are there enough engineers to evaluate projects? Enough auditors to verify contracts? Enough operations teams to keep new facilities running once the ribbon is cut? Capacity constraints show up not as dramatic failures, but as cost overruns, maintenance gaps, and projects that run below design throughput. There is also an important, very human dynamic here. When a state can fund more, citizens rationally expect more. The social contract adjusts upward. That can be virtuous if institutions are strong and rules enforce discipline when prices fall. But if the promise is made on the peak of a cycle, the math is unforgiving when the cycle turns. Programs that were easy to expand are hard to unwind. Off-budget commitments that were quick to approve are slow to scrutinize. The time horizon of decision-making shortens because the immediate pressure is to demonstrate visible gains while the money is abundant. Zoom out and connect the dots on this slide. The boom bought time and options. It reduced measurable poverty in the moment. It funded high-visibility programs that many people still remember with gratitude. At the same time, it deepened dependence on a single volatile revenue source, routed more choices through discretionary channels, and eroded the habits of transparency that help states survive downturns. The phrase fragile foundations is not a moral judgment, it is a description of plumbing. When weight is added quickly to a structure, you want thicker beams, straighter columns, and better load paths. If the beams are improvisational and the drawings are off budget, stress will find the weak joints. So the key question this slide poses is not whether spending more on social needs was justified. It is how the spending was structured, recorded, and evaluated. Did the boom years buy lasting capability that endures when the wind shifts? Or did they purchase a series of one-way obligations that assume the wind never will? The data we have on this slide offers a sober hint: strong short-run gains, paired with design choices that made the system less resilient. Keep that mental model handy as we move forward. On this slide we look at the moment when price becomes a permit. The policy tools here are familiar across many countries and many decades: price ceilings, profit caps, and controlled lists of essentials. In Venezuela's case, the laws arrive with clear intentions: protect consumers, punish abuse, ensure access to staples. On paper, it feels like tightening a loose bolt. In practice, it rewires the incentives that keep shelves stocked. Start with the profit cap idea. A rule says, no more than a set margin, often around 30%. That sounds generous to a shopper staring at a receipt. But margins are not the same thing across every product or every point in the supply chain. Grocers live on thin percentages, while spare parts, imported medicines, or low-volume specialty goods need higher margins to survive unpredictable shipping, spoilage risk, and inventory carrying costs. When you flatten allowed profits across widely different businesses, you are not disciplining greed in general. You are selecting who can still operate under the new math. High-turnover staples might survive. Low-volume, high-uncertainty items quietly vanish. Now layer in administrative price setting. Instead of prices moving when costs move, a public schedule or inspector approval decides what can be charged. If your input costs are stable, that might work for a time. But consider an importer of a controlled good who depends on parts priced in foreign currency. The exchange rate shifts. Freight surcharges rise. Insurance jumps. The official retail price does not budge. What do? You delay orders. You cut quality. You reduce package size. You substitute a cheaper ingredient. Or you stop carrying the product. None of those responses show up as a scandal on day one. They show up as thin shelves and quiet workarounds. This is where the textbook meets the checkout line. Price ceilings below the level needed to cover costs create excess demand. Shoppers queue earlier. Inventories sell out faster. And a secondary market appears, because the value difference between the official price and the price that clears the market is real. In Venezuela, that gap acquired a name and a profession. Bachacao. People stand in line, buy at the controlled price, and resell at a higher one. Are they villains? Opportunists? Or simply rational agents responding to a legal price that no longer reflects the effort and risk of keeping that good available? The moral labels are tempting. The economics is simpler. When an official price forbids the transaction most suppliers can afford to make, the trade does not disappear. It moves. Notice how this shifts where the scarce resource lives. Under normal conditions, money and relative prices allocate goods. Under tight controls, time and connections allocate goods. The scarce input becomes hours in a line, social ties to a store clerk, or luck with delivery schedules. That is why you start hearing stories of dawn queues, text alerts when trucks arrive, and sudden, brief appearances of a staple that is gone by noon. The system still clears, but not through posted prices. It clears through waiting and workarounds. Inspectors and compliance officers then become pivotal actors. When the profitability of an item depends on whether a given invoice is recognized, whether a cost count is accepted, or whether a new label passes muster, businesses learn the new skill that matters most: file management. They assemble binders. They rehearse the audit. They reclassify inputs to fit the list. It is not that managers stop caring about logistics or quality. It is that survival requires a second expertise, navigating the administrative maze that stands between their cost structure and their retail price. That overhead is a real cost. It must be paid in time and people, which means it must be paid by someone. If you cannot pass it on to customers because the price is fixed, you pay it by shrinking something else. Controlled prices also scramble the signals that normally tell producers what to do next. Imagine a sudden shortage of cooking oil. In a flexible market, a rising price shouts upstream, make more, import more, move inventory here. Under a controlled price, the shout becomes a whisper. You cannot offer a higher price to pull supply forward, so you try ration cards or purchase limits or inspection blitzes. Those tools can tamp down a spike. They cannot create new supply on command. Over time, the system loses its memory. Producers stop trusting that they will be able to recover costs if they invest in capacity. So they do not. By the time you reach the controlled price lists of 2020, another reality has crept in. Wages have collapsed in real terms for many formal workers. That means even when a good appears at a controlled price, the ratio between a day's pay and a basic basket can look impossible. The system tries to fix this by tightening the screws on listed items. But the same forces remain in play. If the allowed price is lower than the cost of replacing the item, inventories drain, and the item reappears in a different channel, often priced in dollars or with an unlisted surcharge to cover the replacement cost. That is not defiance. It is arithmetic, a word about quality. When prices cannot move, quality often does. Brand names give way to generics. Metal parts are replaced by plastic. Sizes shrink. Service deteriorates. These are not design choices to irritate customers. They are the margin on which a supplier can still meet the rule and remain open. If you have ever felt a product become flimsier while the sticker price held steady, you have witnessed quality adjusting because price was not allowed to. What about fairness? That is the strongest appeal of price controls. Protect the vulnerable from spikes. Punish exploitative markups. The intent is honorable. The question is about results. Do the rules put more of a scarce good into the hands of the people they are designed to protect, sustainably, week after week? Or do they produce initial relief followed by thinner shelves, more time lost to queues, and a shadow price that creeps in through side doors? When the answer is the second outcome, it is not an indictment of compassion. It is a reminder that compassion needs a mechanism that can actually deliver. So the lesson of this slide sits in a single phrase. When relative prices detach from underlying costs, scarcity does not vanish. It relocates. From the receipt to the line, from the checkout counter to the informal market, from a posted number to a quiet handshake. If policy must intervene, the interventions that preserve the signal, targeted income support, transparent temporary subsidies, or open auctions with clear rules, tend to cause less collateral damage than across-the-board caps. The more the system relies on discretion, the more energy society spends seeking discretion rather than producing goods. Hold that picture as we move forward. Controls can delay pain and generate visible wins. But if they cannot keep replacement costs and retail prices in conversation, they set the stage for the next chapter. Not by intent, but by the logic of the tools themselves. On this slide we switch lenses from prices at the checkout counter to the plumbing behind the currency itself. The question is simple. When tax revenue and borrowing cannot cover spending, how do you pay the bills? One answer is monetary financing, also called seigniorage. In plain language, the central bank creates new money and transfers purchasing power to the government. It can feel painless at first. No vote to raise taxes. No new bond auction. Just keystrokes. But money is a measuring tape for value. If you stretch the tape, the numbers on everything else start to change. Here is the basic mechanism. The government has obligations in the local currency. The central bank credits accounts, directly or indirectly, to meet those obligations. Wages get paid. Suppliers get paid. State-owned companies get cash to keep operating. Those new monetary balances then chase goods that did not suddenly become more abundant. If supply is constrained and expectations are nervous, sellers raise prices. Importers look at the exchange rate and preemptively adjust. The price level ratchets up. The next round of spending requires more currency than the last, because yesterday's money buys less today. So the central bank issues more. Each turn of the wheel looks necessary to meet nominal bills, but each turn also erodes the real value of the very money you just created. Seigniorage works a bit like an inflation tax with a Laffer curve. At low, stable inflation, people are willing to hold cash balances, and the state can extract some resources by letting the price level drift upward. At very high inflation, real money demand collapses. People spend quickly, shorten how long they hold cash, and search for alternative stores of value. The tax base shrinks even as the rate goes up. That is why, as monetization accelerates, governments often discover they must print ever faster just to stand still. Around 2017, monetary financing in Venezuela rose to a striking share of the economy by some estimates near 1/10 of gross domestic product. That is not a footnote. It is a regime change in how the budget is funded. What does that look like on the ground? First, the calendar of price changes compresses. A shop that once updated price tags monthly, then weekly, now reprices daily or even twice a day. Menu costs, the hassle of changing numbers, become a full-time job. Second, contracts shorten. Landlords and suppliers refuse long fixed price terms because any fixed number becomes a loss within weeks. Third, the exchange rate turns into the anchor for almost every price. Even goods produced domestically begin to move with the dollar because their inputs, or their opportunity cost, are tied to foreign currency. When the exchange rate jumps, the whole price landscape shifts in minutes. Hyperinflation is the moment the feedback loop outruns the stabilizers. Economists define it as inflation exceeding 50% per month, but the lived experience is more vivid. Salaries that looked acceptable in the morning no longer cover a basic basket by evening. Paydays turn into same-day shopping sprints because holding cash overnight feels costly. A taxi driver quotes a price, then checks a rate before you reach for your wallet. Everyone becomes an amateur macroeconomist, not because they want to be, but because daily survival depends on anticipating monetary erosion. 2 policy moves in Venezuela tried to reset the nominal chaos. Redenominations. In 2018, 5 zeros were cut from the currency. In 2021, 6 more zeros were removed. Think of this like cutting extra slack off a stretched measuring tape. The units become more manageable. Accounting software stops breaking. Price tags look less absurd. But redenomination is a cosmetic repair unless the underlying flow of new money slows. If deficits continue to be filled with the printing press, the tape stretches again, just with fewer zeros on the display. That is why you often see a brief period of easier arithmetic followed by the same upward drift in prices. There is also the psychological dimension. Money is a social technology built on trust. People accept pieces of paper or digits because they believe others will accept them tomorrow at roughly the same value. When that belief weakens, money starts to fail at its 3 jobs as a store of value, a unit of account, and a medium of exchange. You see this in tiny behaviors. Shopkeepers post prices in one unit but whisper the real price in another. Workers negotiate frequent adjustments instead of annual raises. Households build mental ledgers in a harder benchmark and treat the local currency as a temporary ticket that burns the longer you hold it. None of this requires a decree. It is a spontaneous adaptation to protect purchasing power when the formal anchor has slipped. Notice what we did not need to argue on this slide. We did not need to claim that any one official intended high inflation. The mechanism runs on incentives. If borrowing on reasonable terms is closed, if tax capacity is narrow, and if spending is politically or socially difficult to cut, pressure flows toward the institution that can create means of payment on demand. The central bank becomes the shock absorber. In the short run, that keeps payments moving. In the long run, it undermines the very currency those payments rely on. So the core lesson of this slide is surprisingly modest. Money cannot do the real work of balancing a budget. It only moves claims around. When the printing press is tasked with closing structural gaps, the result is not free resources. It is a general rise in prices, an acceleration in the speed at which people try to spend, and eventually a loss of confidence that reshapes how everyone transacts. Redenominations can tidy the numbers, but only restraint in creating new money, paired with credible fiscal anchors, can restore the function people actually need from a currency, a measuring tape that does not keep shrinking. On this slide we ask a deceptively simple question. Why did barrels stop flowing? Was it the rock, or the rules? Venezuela did not run out of hydrocarbons. What thinned out year after year was the system's ability to turn geology into reliable production. Start with timing, because timing disciplines stories. The production decline begins well before the broadest external sanctions arrive. After the strike and mass dismissals in the early 2000s, PDVSA lost a deep bench of tacit know-how. That is not a slogan. It shows up in the unglamorous routines that keep output steady. Preventive maintenance. Turnarounds done on schedule, not when something breaks. Blending recipes that keep heavy crude moving. When those routines are disrupted, small problems become large ones, and large ones become outages. Next, underinvestment. A national oil company can look healthy on paper if cash transfers to the budget are high, even while its core capital base is aging. Drilling programs get trimmed. Workovers are postponed. Spare parts inventories run down. Refinery and upgrader projects drift to the right on the calendar. You see the shift in the composition of spending. More on immediate obligations, less on the long lead items that actually create future barrels. Managers learn to solve near-term cash demands, not long-term capacity constraints. Layer on politicization. When senior roles turn over for political reasons, when procurement and project selection migrate toward central discretion, engineers spend more time writing memos and fewer hours solving field problems. The organization's feedback loops weaken. A field superintendent used to have authority to fix a pump today and file paperwork tomorrow. Now the order reverses. Paper first, pump later. Production does not collapse in a single dramatic fall. It frays. A few thousand barrels per day at a time. Currency and import frictions add sand to the gears. With exchange controls in place, getting dollars for critical inputs becomes an administrative exercise. A compressor seal that used to take weeks can take months. A specialty chemical arrives late and at half the needed volume. Blending diluent is available one quarter and scarce the next. In heavy oil operations, that kind of variability shows up immediately as throughput losses, because the logistics chain is tight even on a good day. Only after that slow structural weakening do the major external financial restrictions land. In 2017, new debt and equity financing channels narrow sharply. In 2019, the designation of the National Oil Company forces a rapid reconfiguration of buyers, traders, shipping, and payment routes. The practical effect is not abstract. Trade credit shrinks. Insurance and shipping costs rise. Diluent supplies for blending are harder to secure. Barrels that still exist in the ground cannot all find a straightforward path to market. Each workaround takes time, discounts, and new counterparties willing to take compliance risk. So which factor matters most? The honest answer is that the pieces stack. The early human capital shock, years of underinvestment, and politicized decision rights brought output down from its highs and made the system brittle. The later sanctions layer then pressed on a structure already under strain, accelerating the fall and complicating every fix that required outside finance or trade. That is why the timeline is the key test. It prevents us from explaining a decade of decline with a single policy change at the end. What does the data contour look like at a high level? From peaks above 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, output trends downward over the next 2 decades, falling to well under 1 million barrels per day by 2020. After that low, there are partial, policy-dependent upticks, but nothing that erases the deeper pattern shown on this slide. The shape of the curve mirrors the story we just told. First, internal capabilities erode. Then, financing and market access tighten. The result is a cumulative loss of productive capacity that cannot be reversed by a single decree. Hold on to that sequence as we move on. If the causes arrive in layers, remedies must also arrive in layers. Rebuild human capital and maintenance discipline. Recreate predictable investment channels. Reduce the administrative friction that turned every input into an approval. Only then do external constraints stop being decisive. The calendar matters because it tells you where to start. This slide is about the awkward middle ground. Not a full reform, not a full command system, but something in between that many Venezuelans began to live with day to day. The phrase you will hear on the street is simple. Dollar prices. De facto dollarization. What does that actually mean in practice? Start with the shop window. In many neighborhoods, prices begin to appear in dollars or are quietly quoted in dollars even when a Bolivar sticker still sits on the shelf. Why? Because suppliers think in hard currency for replacement costs, and because the exchange rate moves faster than any printed label can keep up. When the unit of account stabilizes in people's heads, shelves behave differently. Importers can place orders because they expect to recover costs in a unit that will not melt between shipment and sale. Wholesalers can restock on a predictable cycle. Retailers stop playing the daily guessing game with the Bolivar and post dollar lists on WhatsApp like a morning weather report. The result is visible. Some inventories return. Lines shorten. A category called bodegones explodes in popularity, selling imported goods that had vanished during the strictest control years. At first glance, it looks like normality is back. But look one level deeper. The benefits are uneven. If you earn in dollars because you receive remittances, work for a firm paid in foreign currency, or operate in a niche that naturally earns hard currency, the new system feels like oxygen. If you earn in bolivars, especially in the public sector, the arithmetic is harsher. Even with periodic adjustments or bonuses, the exchange rate can outrun your paycheck. Two people shop in the same store and see two very different realities depending on the unit that funds their basket. Now, what about the rules? Alongside the quiet dollarization, some controls loosen. Inspectors visit less often. Some price schedules fade from daily enforcement. Import restrictions are selectively relaxed, at least for categories where shortages had been most visible. This selective easing is less a law than a posture. It says to businesses, we are not going to chase you as hard if you can keep goods on the shelves and avoid scandalous headlines. The incentive effect is immediate. Traders and shopkeepers take more risk and bring in more stock. But because the easing is not always codified in a clear framework, everyone also watches the horizon for a change in the wind. That watchfulness matters most for investment with long lead times. Here the licensing story enters. Periods of more permissive licensing let certain producers export more crude, import essential diluents, or clear cargoes with fewer hurdles. Output nudges upward. Cash flow improves. Maintenance that was deferred can finally get done. Then, a license is narrowed, expires, or is reinterpreted. A cargo delays. A contract is rewritten. The option value of waiting returns. Managers postpone upgrades because the rule they need for 5 years is only guaranteed for 5 months. This is not ideology. It is risk management. When policy toggles, you hedge by staying light and reversible. Back to the household level. De facto dollarization changes how people plan. Families keep a mental ledger in dollars even if they receive income in a mix of units. They aim to hold value in something hard at the end of the week, then convert only what they must for daily expenses. Informal credit adapts too. A friend lends another friend, but now the promise is indexed how many dollars worth by next Friday rather than a fixed bolivar amount. Even wages morph. Employers experiment with mixed compensation, a base in bolivars for paperwork purposes, plus a variable bonus pegged to a dollar reference to reduce the painful gap that opens after every exchange rate move. None of these practices needed a decree. They spread because they solved an immediate coordination problem between buyers and sellers who were tired of doing FX math at the register. There is a public finance side to this split regime. When more transactions happen in dollars and prices are mentally set in dollars, the old mechanism of financing deficits through the printing press loses some of its power. That is good for stabilizing the month-to-month price level, but it also means the state's easy lever has shortened. At the same time, taxing an economy that is increasingly dollarized and informal is administratively harder. So the budget lives in a new tension. Less capacity to inflate, but also less ability to broaden the tax base quickly. In that environment, discretionary fees, one-off levies, or ad hoc compliance drives can start to play a larger role than broad, predictable tax instruments. Businesses feel those as a background hum of uncertainty. What does this hybrid order do to competition? On one hand, easing controls and pricing in dollars let nimble traders re-enter categories that were previously unviable. Variety improves. On the other hand, firms with better access to hard currency and logistics networks gain a structural edge over smaller operators who are still patching together FX at retail rates. The market becomes more tiered. Premium goods return at realistic, hard currency prices. Basic goods exist, but their availability fluctuates for customers still paid in bolivars. The visible surface looks like abundance, but the experience of abundance depends on which side of the currency divide you inhabit. Notice the sociology that emerges. Restaurants reopen with menus priced in dollars. Pharmacies carry a wider set of medicines, also posted in dollars. Meanwhile, public sector workers and pensioners watch their purchasing power seesaw, often chasing dollar prices with bolivar incomes that lag one step behind. The coping strategies multiply. Side gigs. Remittances. Informal resales. Families split responsibilities across borders so that one member's hard currency income props up others. The macroeconomic label is dual currency. The human label is patchwork survival with islands of stability for those lucky enough to stand on them. There is one more behavioral shift worth naming. In a regime where licenses and permissions can change quickly, firms adopt a barbell strategy. Keep core operations as simple and liquid as possible. Then experiment at the edges when licenses turn green, but always with an exit plan. That means short commitments, short inventories, and fewer irreversible bets. It also means that even when a policy window opens and allows a burst of production or trade, the system does not automatically rebuild the deep capabilities that require stable, multi-year horizons. You can rent a workaround. You cannot rent confidence. So what is the honest read of this partial adjustment? It bought time. It reduced daily chaos. It replaced some of the worst frictions with workable, if unequal, routines. That is no small achievement for ordinary people who needed medicines, staples, and a little predictability. But as long as the underlying rules remain discretionary, as long as the currency you are paid in and the currency you must spend diverge, and as long as licensing cycles can shift the ground beneath long-term plans, stability rests on a narrow ledge. It feels solid until the next gust of policy or the next external shock. This slide does not ask you to praise or condemn the hybrid. It asks you to see its structure. Shells can look better while deep investment remains cautious. Prices can stop racing while the unit in which they are quoted divides the audience into two experiences. Licenses can lift output in one quarter and compress it the next. It is a truce with fragility. Useful, real, but not yet a replacement for rules that make multi-year commitments rational again. On this slide we strip the story down to a principle you can use anywhere, in any sector. Do outcomes depend mostly on the personalities in charge, or on the rules that outlast them? Institutions are just rules with memory. Incentives are how those rules feel at ground level. When the two line up, systems behave. When they clash, the cleverest actors spend their energy dodging, not building. Start with the exchange rate, because it transmits almost every other decision. A rule-based regime says there is one market where price is clear, and anyone who has legal dollars can buy or sell at that rate. That simple promise does more than tidy a spreadsheet. It erases arbitrage lines, compresses the space for special permissions, and tells importers and exporters the number they can plan around next quarter. A discretionary regime, by contrast, spawns multiple rates and approvals. Now the profit is not in moving goods. It is in moving applications. Which system do you think attracts people who want to ship, and which system attracts people who want to lobby? Next, money. An independent monetary authority is not a guarantee of virtue. It is a speed limit with a camera. The rule is explicit. The consequences are predictable. If deficits widen, the answer cannot be print now and hope later. The answer must be match spending and revenue or borrow on stated terms. That constraint looks annoying in boom times when revenue feels effortless. But it is precisely in booms that a rule prevents quiet overreach. When the tide goes out, the currency still has an anchor because the institution did not trade long-term credibility for short-term applause. Now to the budget. A fiscal anchor converts volatile rents into smooth paths. One version uses a conservative reference price for oil, saving the excess in good years and drawing down in bad years according to a pre-announced formula. Another uses a structural balance rule that targets the budget after filtering out the cycle. The details can vary, but the logic is constant. You do not promise what windfalls cannot fund every year. You publish the arithmetic. You invite outside auditors. And you accept that a rule which binds you in the boom is the same rule that protects you in the bust. What about the warehouse for those savings? A transparent sovereign wealth fund is not a trophy. It is a ledger with lights on. The rule here is public reporting frequent, plain, and audited. Deposits follow the formula. Withdrawals follow the same formula. Portfolios are disclosed with enough clarity that citizens and legislators can see whether managers are taking smart, diversified risk or quietly financing today's gap with tomorrow's assets. The point is not to be fancy. It is to be boring in the best possible way so that political cycles cannot quietly hollow out the buffer meant to stabilize them. Resource licensing and procurement are where many systems either go clean or go murky. A rules-first approach runs open auctions with pre-published criteria, publishes the winning bid and the contract, and enforces performance clauses that everyone can read. A discretion-first approach uses direct awards and case-by-case exceptions. The first model attracts operators who are good at projects. The second attracts operators who are good at relationships. Over time, those choices compound into either a capability base or a favor network. Price policy for essentials belongs on this slide too. A rules-based way to protect vulnerable households is to support income directly or subsidize transparently at the point of need, not to command a universal price that ignores replacement costs. Why? because a targeted transfer preserves the signal that tells suppliers to produce and restock. A ceiling that detaches retail price from cost silences that signal and reroute scarcity into lines and side payments. The intent in both cases is the same. The mechanism is not. Rules that preserve signals usually deliver more of the thing you are trying to protect. Notice the common thread. Rules shorten the distance between effort and reward. If you can earn a return by cutting downtime, improving logistics, or innovating on process, you chase those gains because the system will let you keep enough of them to make it worthwhile. Discretion lengthens that distance. Now you must also earn a return in the approval queue. With every extra step that depends on a signature rather than a published criterion, energy shifts from producing to persuading. There is a planning horizon effect as well. Clear rules lengthen the horizon because they make next year look less like a dice roll. Firms justify maintenance cycles, invest in training, and finance long lead projects when they expect the same rule to hold across elections. Discretion shortens the horizon. You rent capacity instead of building it. You hire temporary fixers instead of training permanent teams. You overuse the quick patch because the durable repair will only pay off if the rule still exists when it is finished. If you want a single image for this slide, think about a busy intersection. With a traffic light, cars move in pulses. Everyone understands when to go and when to wait. Throughput is high because the rule is simple and automated. Replace the light with a person in the road waving cars through one by one, and two things happen. First, movement slows. Second, the value of knowing the person goes up. At small scale, that can look like responsiveness. At large scale, it becomes a bottleneck you cannot see around. An economy is just many intersections stacked together. Choose the light where you can. Restrict the hand waving to the rare, truly exceptional case, and write down exactly when it is allowed. The promise of rules is not moral perfection. It is predictable imperfection that people can plan around. The promise of discretion is not automatic failure. It is variable performance that people must insure against. In systems built on volatile rents, the temptation to centralize and improvise is strongest when the numbers look good. That is precisely when rules do their quiet work. They hold you to disciplines that feel unnecessary in the moment and essential in hindsight. This slide is about the quiet heroes in an economy: the households, shopkeepers, drivers, nurses, and tinkerers who refuse to wait for perfect policy before they solve today's problems. When the top-down levers misfire, people build bottom-up circuits. It is not glamorous. It is not always legal. But it is deeply rational, and it keeps life moving. Begin with the diaspora. When jobs and predictability dried up, millions left, and with them went a bridge of support back home. Remittances function like a family-sized stabilization fund. Dollars arrive not on a politician's timetable, but when a cousin finishes a shift abroad and taps send. That money is targeted by intimate knowledge. It buys medicine this week, repairs a pump next week, funds a nephew's tools the week after. In textbook language, remittances smooth consumption across shocks. In real life, they keep a refrigerator running and school shoes on a child's feet. Over time, those flows do more than fill gaps. They seed micro-enterprises: a sewing machine, a used freezer, a small delivery motorcycle that spin off their own small incomes. Next, the informal market and the micro-logistics that feed it. When shelves thin or controlled prices fall below replacement cost, entrepreneurs step into the space between desire and supply. They learn border schedules and back roads. They memorize which wholesaler actually delivers on Thursdays and which one only promises. They post daily price lists on messaging apps and run same-day delivery with motorcycles and backpacks. Is there a markup? Yes, because they are selling time, risk, and knowledge as much as they are selling rice or soap. You can dislike the outcome. You cannot deny the coordination service it provides when formal channels stall. Dollar pricing changes the choreography of these adaptations. Suppliers quote in the unit they can restock in. Households do mental arithmetic in the unit they trust to hold value through the weekend. Street vendors carry two price memories at once, so they can accept whichever currency a customer has without being wiped out by tomorrow's exchange rate swing. Payment rails adapt. Cash where possible. IOUs within tight circles of trust. Digital dollars or transfers when both sides have access. None of this needed a central announcement. It spread because it reduced the number of unpleasant surprises between ordering a good and actually receiving it. Microenterprise becomes the shock absorber of last resort. Home bakeries appear when flour shows up. Phone repair tables multiply because a revived battery is cheaper than a new handset. Mechanics keep fleets alive with cannibalized parts and a folk science of what can be welded, sleeved, or shimmed for one more month. Hairdressers, tailors, and food vendors run pop-up schedules around blackouts and water outages, texting customers when the lights are on. The rule is simple. If a service can be delivered with little fixed capital and a lot of ingenuity, it will reappear despite the macro headwinds. Social capital becomes a kind of currency. Reputation stands in for collateral. A shopkeeper extends a small line of credit because your aunt has never missed a payment. Neighborhood groups pool funds to bulk buy essentials at a discount and then divide the lot on the sidewalk with scales and notebooks. Churches, clinics, and civic groups coordinate donation drops and community kitchens, substituting volunteer logistics for the distribution the formal system could not reliably provide. Enforcement is social. Pay late, and you do not go to court. You lose face. In fragile environments, that can be a stronger penalty than a fine. Adaptation shows up in infrastructure too. Families collect water in drums and rotate storage to keep it usable. Generators hum during scheduled outages, sometimes shared across apartments with extension cords and carefully negotiated quiet hours. Solar panels appear on rooftops not as a fashionable gesture, but as a hedge against a clinic's refrigerator warming up overnight. Sturdy UPS units protect a point-of-sale terminal so that a small store can stay open when power flickers. Each device solves a tiny problem. Together they weave a safety net that did not exist on paper. There are costs. These workarounds reward those with access to dollars, networks, or mobility. They raise barriers for those who must pay in a weaker unit or who lack the social links to tap the informal channels. Time becomes a tax. Standing in line is labor. Searching is labor. Learning the week's unwritten rules is labor. And every extra hour spent navigating a shortage is an hour not spent creating new value. Agency can cushion a fall. It cannot, by itself, rebuild the floor. Still, there is a moral clarity to what we see on this slide. When systems grow discretionary and signals grow noisy, voluntary coordination often preserves more welfare than edicts. Not because people are saints, but because they are close to the problem and pay the price of getting it wrong. The same impulse that keeps a bodega stocked also keeps a neighborhood's medicine cabinet from going empty. It is decentralized trial and error, guided by prices, trust, and necessity, not by slogans. So what should we learn from this pattern? First, do not confuse informality with chaos. Much of it is rule-bound, just not by state paperwork. Second, policy that criminalizes every workaround tends to destroy value without restoring reliability. Policy that legalizes and channels the useful parts of these networks can scale what already works. Finally, the presence of vibrant adaptation is both a tribute to human resilience and a diagnosis. People build parallel systems when the main one cannot be relied upon. If you want the improvised circuits to fade, you do not police them harder. You build a formal system that outcompetes them on speed, price, and trust. That is what this slide is asking you to see. Agency did not fix everything. It did, however, keep a society breathing when the official lungs were weak. And it leaves behind a question any reformer must answer. How do you design rules that honor this bottom-up intelligence rather than smother it? This slide is a thought experiment with a purpose. We are not rewriting history. We are testing mechanisms. If you change the rules of the game, do players behave differently, and do the outcomes improve in ways a society can actually feel? First question. What if windfalls had flowed through transparent, rules-based buffers instead of off-budget funds? Picture a very boring machine with 3 gears. Gear 1, a conservative reference price for oil that is deliberately lower than the market during booms. Gear 2, a formula that sends every dollar above that reference into a published savings account with quarterly reports and outside audits. Gear 3, a withdrawal rule that only unlocks funds when prices fall, capped by a percentage to avoid draining the tank in a single year. What changes if that machine is in place? Spending paths flatten. Projects with long paybacks become easier to approve because future cash flows are less of a guess. Maintenance cycles survive political weather because they are funded by rule, not by emergency. Off-budget shortcuts become less tempting because the big spigot now has glass walls and a flow meter the public can read. Would that have solved every bottleneck? No. But it would have cut the amplitude of the cycle, and smaller waves are easier to surf. Second question. Would a unified, market-clearing exchange rate and hard budget constraints have preserved non-oil tradables and a healthier PDVSA balance sheet? Imagine one price for foreign currency that anyone can access legally, paired with targeted support for the most vulnerable so that the initial relative price shock does not land on the poorest households. Now the gap that once rewarded Q skills and connections disappears. Importers order based on cost, not on approvals. Exporters see a price that actually rewards effort. Over time, factories that were stuck in neutral at an overvalued official rate begin to look viable again because they can buy inputs and sell output without running an administrative gauntlet. At the same time, a hard budget constraint for the national oil company says your transfers to the treasury cannot cannibalize the capital spending that keeps tomorrow's barrels alive. In plain language, the rules force a trade-off to be faced early rather than late. There is pain in that honesty. Prices adjust. Some subsidies become explicit rather than hidden in an exchange rate. But the system regains the only signal that reliably tells producers to produce and investors to invest. Third question. How should sanctions be designed when state capacity is already degraded? The counterfactual here is not everything or nothing. It is precision. If the policy goal is to pressure decision-makers while minimizing collateral damage, the design space includes carve-outs that keep safety-critical inputs and humanitarian channels open with real-time transparency. It includes licenses that are as clear as they are firm, with predictable renewal criteria tied to observable behavior rather than calendars alone. It includes escrow or monitored payment structures that let oil be exchanged for strictly defined imports without unlocking general-purpose finance. Would such designs eliminate all unintended effects? No, but they would reduce the number of times a barrel that could be safely produced is stranded by ambiguity, or a spare part for a compressor gets stuck in paperwork that was never meant to catch it. Now, picture the decision tree on this slide. At the top, the same windfall. Down the left branch, off-budget discretion, multiple exchange rates, and a company used as a cash box. That branch buys visible programs quickly, then runs into shortages, eroding capacity, and the eventual need to print or scramble for workarounds. Down the right branch, formula-based saving and spending, a single FX market with targeted income support, and a national oil company judged by commercial and safety metrics rather than its short-term transfers. That branch looks slower at first. Fewer ribbon cuttings. More paperwork. But it accumulates something fragile economies rarely get time to build: credibility. And credibility is not an abstraction. It shows up as lower risk premiums, as longer contracts, as maintenance crews that can plan a year ahead instead of a week ahead. There is a fourth, uncomfortable counterfactual worth voicing. What if the off-budget funds and the exchange controls had been temporary with pre-announced sunset clauses and automatic reviews? Even discretionary tools behave better when they are placed on a timer. The act of writing an expiration date forces administrators to justify renewal with data rather than habit. It also signals to businesses and households that the exceptional will not quietly become the everyday. Would sunsets have guaranteed discipline? No. But they would have raised the political cost of drift and made it easier to revert to rules before fragility hardened into structure. A last comparison helps crystallize the stakes. In one world, the state tries to stabilize outcomes by fixing many prices and deciding many flows directly. In the other world, the state stabilizes rules and lets prices carry information. Both models claim to protect the vulnerable. The difference is in the mechanism. One approach spreads scarcity by decree and hopes distribution will keep up. The other approach allows prices to move but uses targeted support to keep basic access intact while supply responds. Neither path is painless in a shock. The question is which one preserves the feedback loops that rebuild capacity rather than draining it. That is the spirit of this slide. Not to wish away hard choices, but to show how different rule sets produce different incentive landscapes, and how those landscapes accumulate into very different futures. The point of counterfactuals is not nostalgia. It is design. If we can see the forks in the road more clearly, we can choose better when the next windfall or the next crisis arrives. We have followed a long arc today. From the first gushers around Lake Maracaibo to the complex reality of controls, shortages, money creation, and the uneasy calm of partial dollarization. If there is a single thread through all of it, it is this. Systems make incentives. Incentives make behavior. Behavior makes history. Oil wealth promised options. What it could not promise was discipline. When the center held most of the levers, short-term wins often outran long-term upkeep. Price caps protected receipts but thin shelves. Exchange controls promised order but rewarded queue skills over logistic skills. Monetary financing paid urgent bills but dissolved the unit that bills were measured in. None of these outcomes require villains to explain them. They follow from the wiring. There was another story running in parallel. Households and shopkeepers building bottom-up circuits when top-down circuits flickered. Remittances acting like a familicized stabilization fund. Micro-enterprises turning knowledge of schedules and suppliers into same-day delivery. Informal rules filling gaps left by formal rules. Agency did not fix the macro math. It did, however, keep the lights on in thousands of small ways while the big debates continued. So what travels beyond Venezuela's borders from this case? First, the idea that rules can be merciful. A single, legal foreign exchange market with targeted support is not cold technocracy. It is a way to let supply respond while protecting those who need help most. A fiscal anchor that saves in the boom is not austerity for its own sake. It is a promise that clinics will have medicines when the cycle turns. An independent monetary authority is not a luxury. It is the fence that keeps tomorrow's currency from being spent today. Second, compassion needs a mechanism. If the goal is access to food and medicine, the tools that preserve replacement cost signals while aiding incomes tend to deliver more of both over time than universal price ceilings. If the goal is public investment, the tools that publish the arithmetic in advance tend to build more roads that still have crews 5 years later. If the goal is stability, buffers with glass walls usually outlast funds with back doors. Third, credibility compounds. When households believe prices will carry information and that rules will outlive any one minister, they make longer plans. That shows up as maintenance done on schedule, apprenticeships that are worth finishing, and investment that does not need a fixer to survive. You do not see credibility on a ribbon-cutting day. You see it in what keeps working when attention moves on. There are moral questions here too. Who pays the time tax when scarcity is allocated by lines instead of prices? Who gains when permissions decide more than performance? Who loses when money stops keeping its promises? These are not abstract puzzles. They are lived every day by workers paid in a weaker unit than the one posted on the shelf, by nurses who watch inventories whip back and forth, by engineers who know what the maintenance log should look like and what it actually looks like. If you remember only one sentence, make it this. Durable prosperity in a resource economy is less about what comes out of the ground and more about the rules that turn volatility into patience. That means budgets that do not surf the cycle, prices that carry signals rather than permits, money that measures rather than melts, and space for voluntary coordination to do what it does best, which is match needs and knowledge faster than any checklist can. Before we close, a quick roadmap for your own reflection. If you were handed one lever to redesign in a resource-rich country, would you start with the exchange rate, the budget rule, the money, or the licensing process? Which change would most shorten the distance between effort and reward? Which one would most lengthen planning horizons for the people who actually keep systems running? Thank you for watching this episode of Truth Behind History. If this kind of careful, thought-provoking history is your thing, please like the video, drop a comment with the one rule you would change first, and subscribe for more. And if you want to go deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase in the description. We post thoughtful and entertaining history regularly, so explore the channel and choose your next deep dive. I'll see you in the next one.